Good evening, welcome. It's so great to see so many of you here. I'm Christopher Atkins, the Van Otterloo Weatherby Director of the Center for Netherlandish Art here at the museum, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Before we start, we'd like to acknowledge that the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston is in Boston, Massachusetts. Founded in 1870, the MFA stands on a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different Algonquin nations, including the Massachusetts. As a museum, we acknowledge the long histories of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. This land acknowledgement is being actively discussed and reevaluated to be a more actionable statement that reflects our current commitments and collaborations. Indeed, tonight's is a collaboration, is a collaboration of a different sort. Our program is co-organized by the CNA and the Netherlands Innovation Network. And I'd like to thank our really valued colleagues and partners in this endeavor at the Netherlands Innovation Network, Kim Tran and Tazrin Hossein. I also want to acknowledge and thank the team at the MFA who made this event possible, Kristen Hoskins, Paige Moreau, Helen Sturm, behind the scenes working the AV Magic, Nate Burks and Dan Small, and the tireless, I'll make it easier, Elisa Trejo, who was working so much to make it happen. And of course, I want to thank and acknowledge the founders of the Center for Netherlandish Art, Rosemary and Ike van Otterloo, and Susan and Matthew Weatherby. The CNA's mission is to promote the study and the appreciation of Dutch and Flemish art, especially of the 17th century. This program, which is our third in collaboration with the Netherlands Innovation Network, really epitomizes part of our approach, bringing people together around great works of art and seeing what conversations happen when we get together and talk. Also, when experts from different disciplines share their perspectives and their expertise, and perhaps maybe help us see things in new ways and think about different things, not only in the past, but about our present. Let me say a few words about how this program is going to work. So what we're going to have is a panel conversation with our panel of experts, talking about innovation in arts and science in the Netherlands, then and now. But we also really want this to be a conversation as the evening unfolds with you. So we're going to invite you at different points to enter into the conversation, not exclusively in a traditional Q&A, but to participate. And there'll be our colleagues who will be up and down the aisles with microphones enabling that to do so. So please be prepared to discuss, engage, and don't be shy. With that, it's now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel for this evening. Perry Chapman, Professor Emerita of Art History at the University of Delaware. Amito Haarhuis, Director at the Rijksmuseum Boerhaave. Kasper Roet, CEO of QurAlis. And our conversation will be moderated this evening by Sarah Mastrangelo, Cunningham Associate Conservator in Painting here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Sarah, panelists, I welcome you.
Hello, how's it going? So thank you all for coming this evening. It is quite a privilege to share the stage with you all and have this conversation. We're going to be doing a bit of close looking, and we'll be exploring innovations in seeing and considering new devices then and now in optics that help us see art, life in a different way. So something that I spend a lot of time with, and I think quite a few of us up here work with this thing called the microscope. And it's had a huge impact on kind of the world, obviously. But I want to send it over to you, Amito, to let us know a bit about the microscope.
Yeah, I'm a director of a museum in the Netherlands, Rijksmuseum Boerhaave, National Museum of Science and Medicine. And here you see one of our top objects, which is the microscope of Antoni van Leeuwenhoek. And right now we have an exhibition about him because it's 300 years ago that he passed away. So the object on the right, the silver object, it's a tiny object. It's a single lens microscope. It's only 4 inches long. And Van Leeuwenhoek made those microscopes himself. He isn't the inventor of the microscope that some people call him, but because at the time there were other microscopes, usually with 2 lenses. But this particular microscope was the best microscope at the time, and it stayed the best microscope for 150 years. And it magnifies up to 250 times.
That's pretty incredible. How exactly does it work, for those of us who aren't sure?
So it's actually a very simple design. So basically it's 2 metal plates. In this case it's silver. He also made microscopes of copper and even of gold. There are only 11 left in the world, and we have 4 in our collection. This is a silver one and one of the most magnifying microscopes that there are, 250 times. So in between those 2 silver plates, there is a tiny lens, only like 2 millimeters, like ball-shaped, and it's at the top part. You see a little point with a pin in front of it, and actually on the pin you put the specimen, and then you look through this tiny little hole from the other side. So you need to keep it very close to your eye. At the bottom part you see a little handle where you can hold it, and you need to hold it right next to your eye, and the specimen is right on the other side.
And each microscope was unique in the sense that there was a singular specimen for each of these microscopes that he created.
Yeah, he created hundreds of those microscopes because it wasn't very difficult to make the microscope, and maybe it was even more difficult to make a very good specimen. So, for instance, the eye of a fly that he would put up on the pin. It was very difficult to prepare that. He did it. Usually, he made specimens with his own razor blade, but the razor blades of the 17th century weren't as sharp as the knives we have right now. So it was quite tricky to make a very good specimen. So once he would have a good specimen, he would save it in his drawer so he could look at it again.
So, you know, he's seeing microorganisms for the first time.
Yeah.
And so how do you describe that to someone? How does that, at this time period when no one knows what they're really looking at, how does he describe this to people?
Yeah. So, he was the one to see microorganisms for the first time. So to do that, he would make very thin capillaries, I think you call it capillaries, and he would suck up some water from a pond with microorganisms in it. And he was the first one to see those microbes, because this microscope magnifies up to 1 micrometer, and that is actually enough to also see a bacteria. So that's why he was the discoverer of the micro world. But at first, nobody had seen those microorganisms before. So he saw something that nobody had seen before. And
it's kind of life-changing,
yeah,
earth-shattering.
Yeah. And it also took a long time for him to convince other people that what he saw was real. Because in one droplet of water, he would see thousands and thousands of, he called it little animals. That's what he called it. And he described what he saw. He was one of the most prolific scientific writers at the time. He would correspond with the Royal Society. And he would collaborate with artists to draw what he saw. Right now in our museum we have the original drawings that came over from the Royal Society in London, where they're still being kept. It's very interesting that he worked together with artists. So therefore he was also working on a new visual culture. You could say that it's actually the start of science communication as we know it. Yeah.
I was wondering if we could switch a bit to talk about how he's represented here, because I think he is wearing what would have been called a Japanese-style silk robe, which are these silk and often padded robes that were imported from Japan that scholars had themselves represented in, a few artists, Vermeer's, geographer, I think, or the astronomer. So what is it saying about the idea of, what would he have been called, a natural philosopher, a scientist? How did people think of somebody like Leeuwenhoek in his time?
Yeah. So nowadays we would say he's actually an amateur scientist because he was actually a wool tradesman. And he was also kind of a government official. So he had a job at the municipality of Delft, the city of Delft, where he lived. And in his spare time, because he made enough money having those jobs, in his spare time he was looking through microscopes. He became 90 years old, so for 50 years he's been looking through microscopes and writing about it all the time. And he was writing about it to the Royal Society, but he wasn't a member of the Royal Society at first. But at a certain point, he was offered a membership, and that is what this painting shows. So on the table, you see the document that states that he is now a member of the Royal Society in London, and you see him as a proud man with his wig, and he presents himself like a learned man. And from that time, he also changed his name. So at first, his name was just Leeuwenhoek. And from that moment on, he called himself Van Leeuwenhoek. So that was a bit more important. So he's really a proud man here.
So I'm wondering, what is the philosophical implications of the microscope? Because it was such an earth-shattering thing. It brings us closer to the world. It reveals things about the world that we don't know. What does it mean for the greater world?
So, if I can make this a little bit more personal, I grew up on the fields in the Beemster, and I never really thought about this before until this exhibition, actually. But one of the first real memorable presents I got was a microscope from my parents. And I pulled apart every single living thing that I could find. And it's just flabbergasting once you start to magnify into the world of the unseen. Like, my microscope wasn't as good as Anthony van Leeuwenhoek's microscope. I couldn't see bacteria. But I know what happens if you look at a flea that you can find in the water under a microscope, and it looked really, really scary. And so as a young boy, that was very interesting. So, you know, when you put that in a philosophical perspective, you realize that everything looks different at a different magnification. And I do want to point out some things, because my world started actually to revolve around microscopes. Like, my company is making therapies for a neurodegenerative disease called ALS. But ever since I started my education, my higher education at the University of Amsterdam, the Free University, the Anthony van Leeuwenhoek Ziekenhuis, where I did part of my my PhD, microscopes were basically our main tool. It's a light microscope to look at cells. It's a fluorescent microscope to look at proteins. It's an electron microscope to look at photons, and to look at protein structures and to understand what is going wrong inside of a cell, so that we can make therapies to hopefully prevent that. Now I'm using high throughput microscopes, and I want to point out there's two innovators in this audience, Jonathan Fleming, who started Solomix, the first real high throughput microscope that I worked with, and I had no idea that he actually created that company. And then Tom Forrest-Farb, who is using microscopes to automate cell cultures. And so this day has actually made me aware of these innovations from Anthony van Leeuwenhoek and those 17th century's Dutch innovations, how they are impacting our life currently. Like, our whole medicine industry is based on microscopes. And so, besides the fact that he found microbes and that led to antibiotics and that saved hundreds of millions of lives, Besides the fact that it turned our whole perception of the world upside down, because we could see suddenly at different scales, and I'm not even talking about inverting it and looking at the universe, which is the other impact of that. It has completely innovated our medicine industry.
So I'm going to scoot on to the next image. And so here, just coming back to portraiture and the art world, if you know nothing about these sitters, what do we see when we're looking at this?
Well, I know from what I've learned from you people just preparing for this that we see a man and his wife, and he is a maker of instruments of some sort, but they're not musical instruments, but scientific instruments. But what you see is a couple making music, and she's got the songbook along with her lapdog, and he's got his stringed violin. What to me is fascinating is that the wife looks at him, but his head is turned and he's kind of looking up. And if he were an artist, I would say he's in a pose of being inspired. So for a scientist and an instrument maker in the 17th century, would he have been thinking of himself as being inspired by some higher being or higher power?
And just to interject, we know that the sitters because there's an inscription on the back of this painting. So we do, in fact, know that it's Johann van I'm going to brutal. This is going to be bad. Can you say
Johann van Mussenbroek.
And Margarita?
Van Straten.
Thank you. So we do know the identity of the sitters, and we know that he was a scientific instrument creator, maker. And if you don't mind speaking a bit more about that.
Yeah, he's from a family lineage of instrument makers in Leiden, where our museum is based. And he worked together with the university to make scientific instruments for demonstrations. So it's actually the start of scientific experimentation, right? Before science was mostly theoretical, and now there was a need for scientific instruments to really prove certain scientific concepts. And his family first made brass household products, like oil lamps, but then there was suddenly a market for scientific instruments, and his elder brother was the one who made the first. They called it an air pump in that time, but it's mostly a pump to create a vacuum, because there was a lot of discussion at the time whether a vacuum really existed or not. And they used these kinds of pumps to prove there was a vacuum, and they could do all kinds of experiments with it. For instance, to show that if you put something under a glass dome that made a noise, if you took the air out, the noise would go away. So that would prove that noise was being traveled by air. And Johann van Mussenbroek was able to create a better air pump that you only needed one person to put it in motion. The air pump that his brother created, you needed two people, so it was less practical. So his air pump was a great success, and he started to sell it to the whole of Europe. And that's why he became wealthy, I think, and is portraying himself as a very wealthy man, because, he was also good in marketing his instruments, and became very successful as an instrument maker. Yeah.
And he was making instruments for Van Leeuwen and other people, that was my understanding.
Yeah, he was making those instruments for professors at the university for their demonstrations in class. And their workshop was also right next to the university. Yeah. And he also had sons that were very successful. And one of those sons became a professor at the university, and created, designed the famous Leyden jar. That was the start of the battery. Yeah.
So this painting came into our collection in 1981, and when it came in, there was a question about the blue pigment because there was a visual oddity in it. And what I found, this is a little side note, but we'll come back to a point. And so there was a question about this blue, and they did analysis on it, and the first type of analysis they did was X-ray fluorescence, which, we find the chemical composition of what's in the pigment, and it was kind of pinging copper, which it would be very odd at this time because that pigment would not, it would indicate that would be a layer pigment. And so I found it I always find it really interesting when you go for a non-invasive technique and then have to double back and take a sample and do it with analysis that's a little more old school, a little more back to the basics, back to the microscope, and just do polarized light microscopy to determine what that pigment actually was. It does turn out that it was just ultramarine and massico, which is a lead yellow, and that the copper was coming from the dryer in the medium. But back to, it's just this idea that sometimes you just require a lot of different instrumentation to get the answer, and I feel like that's something that you recognize in your work.
The use of instruments?
Just like numerous instruments.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if you think about our work, my company is using human stem cell models. So we take a patient who has ALS and then take a piece of skin from a patient. We then basically dissociate that, so you get single cells. Those cells are then being transformed into stem cells. So the skin cells become stem cells like an embryo, and those can grow into any different cell type. And so what happens in ALS patients, you have motor neurons that are dying. And so we recreate the developmental process in a dish and make those motor neurons. We do that in big incubators that are CO2 and O2 controlled and temperature controlled until we get little embryos full of these motor neurons that are sick. We then take another enzyme and we change the DNA so that the disease is basically taken out, and then we take that diseased cell and take the cell where the disease has been taken out, and we apply different types of technologies on there to label them with different colors. And so when you're talking about blue, and we talked about this before because I discovered through my mother that Carmen red was used by Rembrandt and was taken from lace. Cochineal?
Insects.
From insects. So in our work, we actually use a lot of fluorescent proteins. The first one called green fluorescent protein was distilled from a jellyfish. Almost all of the fluorescent proteins that we're using are actually coming from little organisms. And so we take those proteins, we link them to antibodies. These antibodies bind different proteins. We can map 7 of them at the same time. And we can visualize with a very fancy microscope a cellular pathway that is representative for disease. Once we do that, we can test molecules and we can see if we can bring that pathway back to normal. And we, again, use a lot of machines and microscopes to read that out. If we identify such a molecule, then we can see if it actually is going to help people. That is, in a nutshell, what we do at our company. But yes, there's a lot of machines involved with that.
And
I just wanted to ask Perry if that's okay, because I'm very curious to what Perry thinks is like the innovation in the art on this particular painting, like something that was done in the 17th century, but not before.
This was done before, but I think one of the important things that speaks to why it's important to know that that's ultramarine blue is that was the most expensive pigment. Mm-hmm. Comes from lapis lazuli. So if her clothes are ultramarine clothes, and I think his, it looks like one of those silk robes even, is of a sort of changeant color that shifts from a sort of reddish maroon to blue. That was one of the most difficult things for the artist to paint. So there's the artist advertising both the preciousness of the pigments as well as the difficulty, so advertising his skill as well, or making a display of his skill. So I think it speaks to their wealth and their status, what goes into the painting in the way of both skill and materials. So there was a real consciousness of skill and the artist's hand in the Netherlands in the 17th century that was somewhat different from in Italy, where there was this emphasis on the disegno and the eye, whereas the Netherlanders were thought to have their talent in their hands. And that comes through here, and it comes through in so many paintings, but it comes through beautifully here.
Do you think that is representative then for all of the inventions that were made at that time, also using your hands, basically?
I mean, the artists have always used their hands, right?
Yeah.
So, but whether I think there's a kind of theoretical consciousness. So there's a sort of, one of the innovations artistically is this theoretical heightened consciousness of what it meant to be an artist, what the skill was, and an innovation, a social innovation, was the attention that gets paid to artists and the status of the artist, which we'll get to in a minute when we talk about the painting studios. But it's a much more self-aware consciousness of what it meant to be an artist.
So it's a good lead into this work, which might take a moment to digest, but the consciousness of the world around them and technology and innovations that are happening. And so this is a phantasmagoria that it created a little later, 1750s, but it would have been something that the Mussenbroek workshop would have created, would have put out there. And so if you don't mind describing kind of how this works. So there's the image on the left, which is without an optical tool. You see the circle with the number 7. And then there's the image on the right with the conical tool. So if you don't mind.
Yeah, so you see that the images on the left and the right are totally different, and the image on the right is only revealed when you use a very special mirror that is shaped as a cone. It's a bit like a laughing mirror at a fancy fair that distorts the image. Mm-hmm. And here you need this conical mirror in order to see the image that. So it's kind of an artistic joke, you could say. It's called anamorphosis. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's been around for some time. You see it in Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors with the skull, if you view it from the side. But these optical tools that delight, who was utilizing them? Who was purchasing them? What was it? Who was the audience?
I'm not so sure, actually.
Yeah. That's a good question, if anyone in the audience knows. But again, going back to this idea that the need of a tool to either create the art, see the art in a different way, what does that bring up for you? Perhaps just the leading question, some artists promoted the use of lenses or the camera obscura to kind of see the world and then decode it and paint it or draw it. And so I wonder if you are familiar with artists who would have been using something like that at this time.
Well, we think of Vermeer, who most likely used a camera obscura. Exactly what he did with it is unclear. speaking to the microscope and the camera obscura, both of them seem to be ways of seeing things that one couldn't previously see before. So the camera obscura worked much like a camera, and Vermeer records some of the heightened colors, the slightly distorted light. But I think it goes with an attitude of you're seeing something truthful that you cannot see with your own naked eye.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an important aspect of it. I have to confess, I don't understand what I'm looking at with these at all, so I can't help you with them. But I think there were collectors who had such different interests. You know, there were people who collected antiquities. There were people who collected prints. And I'm sure there were collectors who had scientific interests, and that they were parts of, not formal groups, but informal groups with interests in precisely this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Collectors who collected shells. I mean, you know, somebody like Rembrandt had all these shells and natural things. So it was a period of an incredible curiosity, and that extended to these optical devices and illusions, and sometimes optical devices that required you to be in a certain spot to see a particular painting. Mm-hmm. So it was a period of huge experimentation.
It's a celebration of science in a way,
yeah.
right? We're using these tools because we can.
Yeah, mm-hmm. But also I think a celebration of creativity.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm interested in hearing from you. Scientists saw themselves, did they, as being creative in a way that is it different from the way scientists see themselves today, or was it similar to the way scientists see themselves today?
Yeah, if I talk about Antoni van Leeuwenhoek, he was like a very curious and driven person. He was, there was an unknown world. He could see it through his microscope, and he was totally excited about seeing something that he had never seen before, and he wanted to understand it. And through this very open inquiry, he also shifted ideas, for instance, about procreation. It's like it was the time where people still believed that new human beings would just sprout from an egg from a woman. He was the one who saw all kinds of sperm cells for the first time, of all kinds of animals, even from himself. And he posed the idea that procreation starts with sperm cell. Mm-hmm. And that sparked a discussion about how it really worked. And there were different ideas, and so it really shifted the whole idea about human procreation. Yeah.
But at the same time, he saw bacteria just splitting and multiplying. So that I find that very interesting. And now we live in a time where you can take a skin cell and use that to fertilize an egg cell, and it's just mind-blowing, honestly, what has happened in the last couple of 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really like this notion of being driven, because somebody like Rembrandt was totally driven, with a different kind of curiosity, but a curiosity about human nature and representing stories of the Bible so over and over again. Curiosity about the printmaking process, where he did things that he was very secretive about, and created prints. I don't think he was completely inventing new printmaking processes, but he was taking them further than people had taken them before. So this sense of it takes a real drive and curiosity to advance things and to innovate.
So creation and the divine, what we're seeing here, brings us to this next painting. And again, in the last slide, we're looking at conical perception and how you utilize that perspective. And in here, Sandra is using perspective to create a work like this. Can you tell us a bit about it?
This is the interior of the St. Bavo Kerk, or the Grote Kerk in Haarlem, which had been a Catholic church and is at this point a Protestant church, and all the images have been stripped away. Sandra spent his career making these architectural drawings in which he draws very, very accurate, this is a painting, but in preparation he draws very accurate architectural drawings and then distorts it in order to create a somewhat different image of the church. In this case, it's the columns are elongated, the roof gets higher, the people get smaller. But I think he's also interested in the church as a church. People have treated these as architectural drawings above all, but I think he's trying to give a sense of a kind of spirituality that goes along. In this case, it's a scene showing the Protestant or the Calvinist preacher preaching to the congregation. You can see women with their little folding chairs, and then he captures the activity that goes on in the church. You can see at the left the dog beater who chases the dogs out of the church. But I think that Sanradam, and there are several others who specialize in these architectural church interiors, are really trying to create a sort of a new substitute for what a religious image would be. We think of these as purely secularized, but I don't think that they would have been seen that way in their time.
So for me, this is a painting about perspective. And I love how it focuses your eye to the center of the church, in the back, actually, the thing that is furthest away. I know an entrepreneur here in Boston who's an astrophysicist, spent most of her life studying the stars and trying to, I guess, find where life comes from. What does it mean? What does the universe mean? What is out there? And then she, at some point, thought, I'm gonna take all that knowledge and those technologies that I've been using, I'm gonna flip them around and putting them in earplugs, headphones, and I'm gonna look inside of the human body, and I'm gonna apply the exact same passion and curiosity that I have for the very large, and gonna turn it into the small again. And I just thought that was amazing, and that you can use the same type of approach to try to find out what the heavens are, and also try to find out, what the soul is of the human being. Maybe a little esoteric, but that is bringing it out for me.
That's absolutely. And we're slowly running out of time, unfortunately. I feel like we could go on forever. So I want to start opening it up to the audience. If you have questions just about what we've seen thus far, or curiosities, I'm going to bring us on to the next slide as you kind of think of some questions for us. And again, creation, optics, and wondering, what are you guys seeing here? What does this painting bring up for you?
Is this for the audience or for us? For them.
For you, for them. Well, we'll start here that this is a very interesting marine painting in the sense that there's a rainbow in it, and it's something that's quite unique in marine paintings. And, we've been talking a lot about microscope, optics, devices to see, and not only does this painting speak about a moment in time after the rain, but it also kind of talks about sight and seeing, and the idea of a rainbow. The rainbow at this time was kind of a new understanding of the rainbow was occurring. For example, with Descartes explaining refraction and reflection, or Newton exploring the boundaries of the prism, the color boundaries. And so this painting can take us in a number of different directions, and I wonder where it takes you. Anyone?
It looks like a wild sea to me. I got seasick very quickly, so I'm glad I'm not there.
Well, I am immediately struck that there's a guy standing up in that small boat right at the very end of the rainbow. And if anybody who's stood up in a canoe or a rowboat, it might be worried about him. The others are rowing furiously. So to me, that rainbow is a hope for these people, but I think one can take that further. So that's not the scientific thinking about rainbow. That's the Dutch person looking at this painting who has experience of the sea, because so many people had experience of the sea in the 17th century. And those ships, the other ships are all, well, the sea is rough, the wind is blowing. A lot of people lost their lives at sea. The Netherlands makes its huge wealth through trading all over the known world. This, I gather, is more related to the North Sea and perhaps the Baltic trade, but whatever, it's a precarious place, and I think that's partly what this picture is about.
And they're moving fast.
And they're moving
because
fast.
There's a lot of wind.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the benefit of being in Boston is it's a very multicultural community, and for me, the rainbow brings the biblical connotation. If anyone here knows the story of Noah and the Ark, where a big flood was brought by God on the evil people, and the rainbow was actually the sign of peace between God and the survivors of that episode. And so I don't assume that the rainbow here came from that story, but as I look at those people fighting for their lives, I would assume that if I were there in one of those boats and I saw the rainbow, I would get hope that this is the beginning of a better time, and hope for a peaceful sea and a peaceful life.
That's great. And if we take it in an art historical direction, it's Philips Angel who kind of, in his praise of painting, talks about the paragone of the rainbow. And so that's kind of an innovative way to look at the rainbow in painting. So the paragone being this argument of whether sculpture or painting is more difficult, better, which one's better? And so the argument here is that painting is better because you're able to you can create the rainbow in the painting, but you can't necessarily create in sculpture. What do you think?
This is so great. I love it. And it also speaks to how different people would have such different reactions to this, to a rainbow. For some it has a kind of spiritual quality. For others it's like, look at what painters can do. It's so amazing. And sculptors couldn't do that, which I think just makes so much sense. Yeah. So you never know when an artist is going to be very self-conscious and self-aware about their creativity, and that they're going to speak to an audience. That's one thing in this period, an audience of really knowledgeable art lovers. They call them liefhebbers. The term comes from love, so that there's that people who are knowledgeable, and art is conveying knowledge in so many different ways.
I was impressed by your pronunciation of that.
So we have a few more minutes for questions. Yes.
I just found the title of the painting to be almost amusing and ironic, because it says seascape with rainbow, and there's all this violence and ships adrift and The wind, clearly this wind is not normal. So I was looking at the contrast between the title and what was happening in the painting and wondering if the artist thought that that was sarcastic. But also it's about what you see. Seascape with rainbow. He's making you focus on the rainbow, but there's all this other stuff going on. So I just was focusing on the difference between the title and what was actually going on in the painting, if that's in English, the right pronunciation,
Well,
interpretation.
I mean, one thing to think about is 17th century artists didn't title their paintings. So, yeah. So somebody else has given it that title. I mean, but yeah, you're so right. If you called it a sea drama or something, it would, yeah.
I take it all back.
Yes.
I think there's something else about this painting that I would like to highlight, and that is there's something missing. When you have a rainbow, you have to have sunlight. Otherwise, you don't see the rainbow. Where's the sunlight here? Normally, if there's sunlight, there would be a reflection of it somewhere on the surface of the sea. There isn't any in this painting.
I wonder where the waves look so white.
No, that's the frost.
That's just the foam in the sea.
Yeah, I have the same scientific idea. Like normally if you see a rainbow, I think the sun comes from behind, and then you see the rainbow in front of you. So if you look at this painting as a viewer, somehow I feel that the sunlight should come from behind me. And here you see a very blue sky behind the clouds. So it's like the sunlight comes from the wrong direction for me.
Hi, I have a more general question. I'm wondering, you've clearly established how important science is at this time and how much it appears in the art and anamorphosis and all the scientific collections you see. How was that knowledge getting from the scientists to the artists? How was it getting to the public? Would the public see these paintings and, understand what perspective was or recognize why these collections are scientifically interesting? How was that knowledge being transmitted?
I'm going to ask a follow-up modifying question on that one, because I think that that's such a good point. I mean, we're talking about people, scientists, artists who lived in the same neighborhoods and went to the same apothecary shops at times. We're buying similar kinds of materials, using similar instruments. So yeah, I would also love to ask about this atmosphere of polymathic interests in the Netherlands during the 1600s. We've talked a lot about this drive towards curiosity in general, and I think that manifests we're talking about people who were neighbors and collaborators, and there was so much exchange going back and forth, but I would love to hear from any of the panelists about that kind of atmosphere of innovation and in general.
So I don't know how that happened in the 17th century, but QurAlis was basically at the startup phase at Lab Central in Cambridge, and I think one of the things Lab Central is doing very nicely is exhibiting artworks from local artists. They call it, I think, Gallery 1832. And in my experience, there's a big separation between artists and scientists. It is actually not a given at all that there is this crosstalk, at least today. So I'm always happy that when it's there, I think everyone is always very focused on their own things. And now everyone is focused on their phone. But I think there needs to be an active effort into making sure that we share these things. And I think this event, I actually applaud that because it's doing exactly that. And again, I don't know how that happened in the 17th century, but I can imagine people were also very busy then because there was so much activity. And yeah, it's always hard to, have a broad horizon and see all the things around you if you're working hard.
Well, but also I'm thinking of the kinds of knowledge that artists and scientists shared. And Sarah mentioned this little booklet called by Philips Angel called In Praise of Painting, and one of the things that it would have been read by artists as well as people interested in art. And Angel goes through the things that artists need to know about. One of them is perspective, which involves mathematics and would have involved scientists or mathematicians, maybe an artist talking. Another is anatomy. Even though we're looking at seascapes and church pictures, artists still learned about anatomy, so that they learned how to dissect bodies. So I think there was some overlap between the interests. And then some of the natural philosophers were interested, say, in classical antiquities, which artists needed to know about. So I'm sure at a certain level, a higher level, there were places where these natural philosophers and the artists came together.
I take it back.
Huh?
No, you just reminded me of one of the topics that we discussed in the preparations about AI and the apprentices that the major artists at that time, like Rembrandt, Vermeer. I assume Vermeer, actually, I'm not sure. But that had these big studios with a lot of disciples that were actually painting a lot of their artworks. And when we did the preparation for this panel, we had a big discussion, like, who's the artist? Is it the disciple, or is it the actual main, is it the teacher? And some of the disciples became recognized, I think. But then we started talking about today's discussion, where AI is used to generate art. And I just wanted to ask the audience, like, who is the artist? The AI program, or is it the person who instructs the AI to generate an art piece? I think that's a very controversial subject at the moment.
Yeah.
But it's a perfect example of the crosstalk, I think, of science and art, because AI is a science-driven tool, that's the way I see it. I think scientists would agree with me. But now it's being used in art form. So yeah, it's a very relevant topic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I'm sad to say it's at the end of our program when we can't get into it.
But we started late, so we can go a little longer.
Oh, we started late, so we can keep going? All right, I take it back. Let's go.
Yeah.
AI.
You just mentioned these large-ish or a few people workshops, but what is so, I think, truly important and amazing is there are something like 150 paintings of interiors of studios from the 17th century Netherlands. And this is a new, treating the studio scene or the picture of the artist as a scene from daily life. And many of them show the artist all alone. And the notion that the artist creates in solitude, and that creativity is, the artist needs to be alone to create, is a kind of myth that gets created. It actually goes back probably to antiquity, but Michelangelo, according to Vasari, painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling with no help. That's a total myth, but it's part of the mystique of the artist. And here you have an artist with his door closed, alone, communing with his work of art, at a period when people are fascinated by artists, absolutely fascinated, and by their biographies, by what they do in the studio. And here you see an artist in front of what appears to be a partially finished religious picture. Behind that is a table with what could be the makings of a still life. So he's kind of pointing out the difference between a religious picture that takes a certain amount of imagination and creativity versus a still life that you can draw from life, which is a very different approach. They thought literally in terms of from the imagination versus from life. They weren't diametrically opposed, they could work together, but this is thinking about how they're conscious of that sort of level of their levels of creativity. I don't know how that fits in with AI at all, but
It's interesting.
But let's go back to the topic of AI then, and if anyone in the audience has anything they want to ask or bring up.
Let me ask the audience.
Yeah.
Who thinks an AI can create art? Just so if you agree with that, put up your hand. I'm just very curious. Can be bad art. It's in the eye of the beholder. So I think that's about like a quarter of the people. So it just tells you how I think there is a big discussion ongoing in society, and when things are rapidly evolving as they are doing now, I think we haven't seen the end of that discussion, but I find it super fascinating myself, because it comes back to what it means to be a human being. It comes back to your earlier questions about, the philosophical, the metaphysical, the temporal perspective, and, can you create something that can create? And so fascinating times.
Yeah, or is AI just a tool like this painter's paints?
Yeah. Or like the students.
Or like the students who can do the work for the painter. Yeah.
Well, I do agree with you. I think AI is a tool to be used, not to be feared. But no.
All I can say is I'm really glad I'm not teaching college students anymore writing their papers with AI.
Tom, you wanted to ask something.
AI is a more recent tool. I think it's extraordinary that Vermeer was using camera obscura. Use of, and I guess I'm wondering was what was going on in Delft? And was there a relationship between Vermeer and Leeuwenhoek? I think they were relatively close. But for an artist to be using that kind of a tool is pretty amazing to me. And I'm wondering, was Delft like Cambridge? I mean, was there a lab central, or was there something special about Delft that both of them, were there about the same time? Was there something about the use of technology or kind of cross-pollination between science and art?
Well,
I know one story about how Van Leeuwenhoek and Vermeer were kind of involved in each other's lives, but it's very different than you would expect. Van Leeuwenhoek was also like a government official, so he would also be responsible for the inheritance of people when they died, and the debts that they would have. And actually he was involved after Vermeer died to take care of that on behalf of the city of Delft. And he actually made the family of Vermeer sell 2 paintings in order to pay for his debts. So that's one story that I know, how they I don't know if they really knew each other during life and how they interacted, but this is a known story, how Van Leeuwenhoek was involved at the end of Vermeer's life. Yeah.
Does it say anything about Delft as a center of innovation? I don't know much about it.
Yeah, Delft was one of the important 17th century cities in the Netherlands, and so there was also an important scientist living there. I can't think of the name right now. Yeah, sorry to disappoint you.
So, unfortunately, we're reaching the end of our program now, but before we go, I just want to hand it over to the Netherlands Innovation Network, our partners there, to kind of wrap up the program for us. Kim?
Hi, everyone. In the preparation, I was told that you already had a very vivid discussion, and I was kind of afraid how the discussion would evolve, but luckily you still had a lot to discuss. It was very fun to listen to. So hi, my name is Kim Tran, and I head the Netherlands Innovation Network here in Boston since this summer. And as Chris has said, we partnered for this event. So we are the science and technology arm of the Dutch Diplomatic Network, and the core of our work is to help innovators innovate. We connect startups and researchers and other professionals doing really interesting things to solving global challenges. In the Netherlands with partners here in Boston. So the core of our work can be very technical, and you might be asking yourself, so why an event with the Center of Netherlandish Art at the MFA? So while we focus on innovation in science and technology, we are always looking for creative ways to spark conversations on global challenges, because we believe that we need everyone at the table to solve these challenges. And I often ask my children at home when I have complicated things, and they usually come up with very good advice too. So I would really invite everyone to the table. So tonight is the third time that we've done an intersection event with the CNA. And every time we do so, we always come away with new perspectives and new knowledge that we didn't have before. And that is what tonight was all about, to carve out that space where communities who might not naturally interact are able to connect with each other and inspire each other in unconventional ways. So you, our guests, play an important role in providing these new perspectives. So therefore, I would like to thank you for joining us, and thank you to our partners at the CNA for working with us to carve out this space. And finally, also a big round of applause for our speakers. We hope you come away with feeling inspired and have a good evening.